Hi everyone, my name is Alex Dunker, and today we'll be going over how we can design and build a unique ID database entirely native to Identity Now. We'll be using some common functions such as the source, event triggers, workflows, search attributes, and a rule, and we'll do a little bit of demoing and show you how we can bring it all together. So first off, why would we use a historical unique ID database? Often organizations, whether for compliance reasons or system reasons, do not want to reissue usernames, IDs, emails. This could be SAM account names from Active Directory, perhaps mainframe IDs, email addresses, or even user principal names. Whether it's compliance or for reasons like rehire situations, it's a very common requirement we'll see with many of our organizations. And while you say, hey, well, why can't I just aggregate all of my historical HR information? Well, there's a few reasons. You're going to have much longer aggregation times. If you have historical user IDs of hundreds of thousands, that can take a real performance hit on your environment. It's also a lot to then manage, and there can be licensing implications if you have more inactive identities than you have active identities. And so today we'll show you a way that we can do this entirely in Identity Now without having to extend additional infrastructure such as additional database tables or web services or anything like that and accomplish this use case. So we have four main elements that we'll talk about. And we really are going to take advantage of some of the unique aspects of a number of these, and we'll dive into that solution now. First off is event triggers. Event triggers are going to help us detect when we have a new instance that we need to add to our unique ID database. Workflows, this is going to be what's going to actually make the entries at the correct time and perform those actions. The source we'll be using is a delimited source. That will be what's holding all of our unique IDs. There's some special aspects that we'll dig into about why we chose that compared to other source types. And then lastly, rules. We'll leverage cloud rules, whether that's an identity attribute rule or an attribute generator rule for a source. And we'll get into why we're using those. So first off, our delimited file source and the core source for this component. Why we're choosing this source is A, for the flexible schema that we can easily change. In the example on the right is a very simple one. You'll see we're using SAM account name and employee ID. However, this can be extended for a number of additional unique IDs you might need to track. Maybe you need to also track email like we mentioned before, user principal name, or another type of email, or another type of ID. The only thing I'll note here is make sure that when you're choosing your account schema ID and the account name, keep default correlation in mind. You're probably going to have a lot of uncorrelated accounts in this source due to the nature of the historical data. But that's okay. Don't worry about that, and we'll talk about why later. But we expect to have uncorrelated accounts in this source. And then there's a few other perks. We're able to bulk load this with the initial accounts, or if we have to restore functionality or add more, it makes it very straightforward. And really, the big key here of why we chose this is the Create Account API and how it functions. This one is a little bit different than most people might expect. Hitting this API does not actually create an account in a downstream source. So for example, if you were using the Create Account API with a JDBC source or a web services source, it would not trigger provisioning to the downstream source. The Create Account API creates the account within SailPoint. So if you were to aggregate from those sources, all those accounts you created via API would be removed from Identity Security Cloud. And with the delimited source account, we don't need to run aggregations. We'll just use this API, and we'll have that continue to live on as we go. And hence why we chose that type of source. We'll take a quick look over in Identity Now with what one of those sources might look like. You'll see here, this is a pretty straightforward delimited account source. We have a number of our accounts where we're tracking both our account name and account ID. And like we mentioned before, we can get flexible with the account schema and add things like a mail attribute or something like that. But very straightforward, very easy to use, minimal configuration that you'll need on this side. Next, we'll talk about our event triggers. An event trigger, if you haven't heard about that before, is the event that tells the workflow to start. The workflow uses this data as an input to then calculate the rest of the results and continue on to perform actions. Event triggers can be used as webhooks with external services, but in this case, we're going to keep it entirely within Identity Now and use it with the workflows. There's two event triggers that you might think of for using with this type of component. First, the one that I would recommend if you're implementing a solution like this to look at is the source account created trigger. The source account created trigger is going to run whenever Identity Security Cloud detects a new account from aggregation and a refresh from that source. This can be an account that Identity Security Cloud created itself, or one that was created in the end source we will still detect. And we'll be able to then process that data either way. The other approach, however, is you could do this at the identity created trigger. This happens anytime a new identity is detected and you have that refreshed and comes from an authoritative source. However, I will note that we generally want to use the source account created trigger because I'm going to encourage folks to generate the attributes for unique IDs or unique usernames when creating the account profile on the source itself. It's generally considered a best practice to generate usernames like that in the create profile rather than the identity attributes. And so if you are doing that using the identity created source, that attribute is not yet available for you to consume in the workflow. And then we have our workflow. So this is going to have three main components. On the right, it looks a little more complex, but we'll dig into that. We're going to make sure we're filtering on the specific sources where we're creating these accounts and these unique usernames. We're going to use the account create API that I spoke about before, and then we're going to have some error handling and retries. So we'll flip over to Identity Now, and we'll pull open our workflows and dig in that too a little bit more and talk about some of the design choices that we can take and we have made. First here, we'll see our trigger. One of the components we'll want to think about is what filter we're putting on a trigger. When you're using workflows, you want to filter any of your triggers to make the system as performant as possible, and that way you don't have a mess of additional events in your historical log. So in this case, we're making sure that the source ID is equal to the source that we care about. In this case, this is coming from my Active Directory source in Identity Security Cloud. You'll see some basic checking to make sure that we have the attributes that we need, such as employee ID or SAM account name. In the case that those don't happen or don't exist, we'll go ahead and send error notifications so that we can fix those later. Then we'll come over on the right side, if we're following our true path, and we'll see this HTTP request. One of the great things about Identity Now and what makes workflows so powerful and flexible is this action. You'll see on the left, for those of you who are familiar with workflows, there's many out-of-the-box actions you can take in Identity Security Cloud to meet any number of requirements. However, there is a limit, and one of the nice things that you should know is that if there is an API in Identity Security Cloud that you want to use, but you don't see a corresponding action for it, it is very straightforward to leverage that API with the HTTP request action. It allows you both to complete authentication for you, so you don't have to complete authentication steps. It'll handle that all for you. You'll see we just have the token URL and a client ID and client secret in there. And then down below, we'll actually have the request URL that we're hitting. This is the action that we're trying to perform, and you'll see here we are hitting the accounts API with a method of post. In our request body, we're going to pass through a few simple things. The attributes that we want our unique ID source to receive. In this case, we're passing the employee ID and the SAM account name, and then the source ID itself. So very straightforward. We're going to let Identity Now handle all the OAuth 2.0 authentication components. And like I said, if you have any other actions you want to take, this is going to be one of the easiest ways to do it. The next steps, we'll check that we're getting a good status code in return. If not, we'll do some error handling and retries. And finally, we get to our success. So a very straightforward workflow for those who are trying to implement something like this. It gives you a lot of flexibility. You know, workflows you'll see like this are generally built in the UI editor. However, this can all be done in JSON as well when you go to export and import these.
One second.
So we'll talk about search attributes. So,
Yep, there you go.
great. So search attributes let us promote specific attributes across multiple sources to search against. This is going to be key because when we have unique IDs, we want to be checking against both our downstream sources as well as our unique ID source. In this case, we'll be searching against Active Directory and our unique ID historical source. However, in another case, you might want to add some of your authoritative sources. You might want to check against Workday or PeopleSoft as well. If you're doing a mail attribute, you might want to check against Workday, Azure, and another system. Or if you're an organization that has multiple directory systems downstream, maybe you have come through merger and acquisitions, search attributes let us commonize sets of attributes. These searches do include uncorrelated accounts, which is one of the great parts. And when you set this up, one note you'll want to make sure is just that you set up your unoptimized account aggregation. The second piece we'll talk about here is the identity attribute rule or attribute generator rule. This is a rule that's going to calculate and return your attributes or your unique ID. It's also going to be what's checking for that uniqueness and leveraging the search attribute configuration. We're going to use the IDN rule util for this and the function search count accounts. And we'll look at what that rule looks like now as well. So first off, the search attribute configuration. This endpoint you'll see here, I have my promoted usernames. Like I mentioned, there's 4 elements for search attributes. There's going to be the IDs of the accounts or the sources we are searching against. In this case is Active Directory and my unique ID source. The names of the attributes that we are promoting across those, and then our promoted attribute name, which in this case is promoted usernames. And this is going to allow us to, in one simple piece of code, when we're checking for uniqueness, to search across these multiple sources. So valuable whether you're just generating usernames and IDs in general, or using a unique ID source like this. In our code here, this is an example of a rule. Up top, really, we just have the generation logic of our username. We won't be digging into this today. Some of you might recognize the code. You can actually find this code on the Colab. Thanks to the SailPoint developer relations team for building something like this. But what we'll really want to pay attention to is our uniqueness check. You'll see here that we're going to take those components that we talked about and perform a function or method that returns the number of accounts across the sources that match that username. So we're looking for one, whether it's in the historical ID database, whether it's in Active Directory. We want to find any instances where that might occur so we can generate a unique username. So let's actually dig into a demo and we'll jump in and show you what might happen. So first thing I'm going to do is we'll pull up our identity list and we'll say, hey, we have Mark Smith's going to be joining. We have some Marks that have joined our organization before. So there's probably going to be some of the user IDs that are taken up. We can even jump into our unique ID source and see, hey, what is a Mark dot something taken up so far? So we can see we have a Mark S, a Mark M, a Mark I. These are all uncorrelated reports, so these represent identities or usernames that were generated in the past and no longer active at our organization. We also have Mark Allen, Mark Drake, Mark Smith, and Mark T. So what we're going to do here is we're going to add Mark Smiths. We'll make it plural. And what we're going to expect is that he should not be issued the ID of Mark S, Mark M, Mark I, Mark T. And we'll see hopefully Mark.H come across here. So we will jump over to our HR source and we'll add an employee. And we'll give him a location and a job and a fun department and make him an active employee. And then send that across. We'll jump over and we'll go ahead to our HR source and perform an aggregation and bring him in like any new hire might be coming into your organization. We have 310 accounts, so we got one more, and we'll go take a look. We have our second Mark Smith, so let's go take a look at his identity and see what was generated. So we have our new Mark Smith here. We'll go take a look at our accounts, and we'll see that Mark was generated the ID Mark.H. He also has an account in the unique ID database with Mark.H. And all of that's been executed through our workflow and our provisioning. And so we can go look at our workflows and see that our execution just ran and it was successful. And the goal here was to get that added, and you can check the exact execution of a workflow and see that history. And we were successful in getting that to come across. I won't bore you guys with the specific details in here, just to show you that we were able to successfully execute that. So what might be our next steps in an implementation like this? Well, you will want to support additional use cases, such as name change. Often we have usernames that change, whether that's our email address, whether that's coming from a change from a marriage, change for any number of reasons. But if you have a legal name change and you need to change your usernames, those might need to be tracked for historical purposes as well. You should also look at performing a backup scripts. You should have something that's going to take your unique ID database and pull that down. Maybe it's a PowerShell script that lives on your IQ service instance and runs on a schedule. Maybe it's a Python script that you can have grabbing it, or you can use some of the TypeScript SDKs from the SailPoint developer team as well. But you want to make sure that you're regularly backing up your unique ID database. And then lastly, we can track additional attributes. As we talked about before, we can look at things like email, we can look at things like user principal name, and more. And with that, that's how we would take the workflows, forms, or workflows, rules, and event triggers, and build a unique ID database entirely within SailPoint. If you have any questions about how we accomplish this, or anything about the product, feel free to reach out. I'd be happy to discuss or answer any questions.